This full committee hearing of the Science Committee is reconvened. We'll return to regular order, and I believe I was the next one in line to ask questions, so I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. And with that, turn to Mr. Tyrone. Would you care to expand and explain a little bit more about your analysis of the Monograph 112 program and all those issues?
Yes. I specifically want to answer a couple of issues that Dr. Sass raised. First, with regard to hemangiosarcomas, I did consider hemangiosarcomas, and it in fact is one of the examples in which IARC excluded exculpatory data. In the second mouse study, where they did not discuss renal tumors, they emphasized the finding in hemangiosarcomas that Dr. Sass referred to. There were 4 hemangiosarcomas in the highest dose group. That was all, none in the other 3 groups. But in the first mouse study, the one where they spent 3 paragraphs on renal tumors, they didn't mention hemangiosarcomas. So it's the same thing that happened with renal tumors. So, and it turns out that in that study, there was 1 hemangioma in the low dose groups and 1 hemangiosarcoma in the mid dose group, and none in the highest dose group. And by the way, that highest dose group, glyphosate was 3% of the diet that they ate for every day for 2 years. It's an incredibly high dose. So you would have expected, if what they saw in the second study was a true high dose effect, you would have expected to see it in the first study. But again, that was not even mentioned in the IARC monograph. And Dr. Sass also raised the issue of the accuracy of the tumor rates that I got from the supplemental tables in the Critical Reviews in Toxicology paper. And in fact, as I pointed out at the end of my comments, everything in my paper has in fact been substantiated by things published since, including comments submitted to the EPA glyphosate SAP by Chris Portier, who was the scientific expert for the IARC working group. And his comments were presenting his statistical analysis of all of the rodent studies that EPA was considering. And they considered many more than IARC, but they also considered all the studies that IARC relied upon. If you look at his tables upon which his analysis was based, in every case in which I indicated in my paper that IARC had excluded tumor rates, those tumor rates are in those tables in the comments he submitted to EPA. They were included in his EPA analysis, which is an admission that they should have been included in the IARC analysis. Moreover, they were exactly the rates that I reported that I got from these supplementary tables in the Grime et al. Review. So certainly Christopher Portier now thinks that those rates are okay.
Thank you, Doctor. Dr. Pester, could you visit with us for a moment about the ways in which the current monograph program classification system on carcinogenicity might be outdated? Expand on that, please.
Well, the primary reason that it's outdated and outmoded and needs to either be scrapped or considerably revised is because they stick with a hazard classification system. All they do is declare something as being carcinogenic or not. Modern 21st century risk assessment-oriented regulatory programs, such as what Dr. Lowett has described with the United States EPA, uses that risk-based system to put hazard in context of risk. How much would cause that effect? What is the potency of that particular chemical? IARC was created over nearly 50 years ago, and they really haven't progressed beyond the point of only classifying things by its carcinogenicity, but not putting it in the context of risk.
Thank you. I think with that now, I will yield back and turn to, I think in the next order would be the gentleman, Mr. Tonko, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And welcome, everyone. This hearing has been framed around the need to uphold scientific integrity standards in publicly funded research. If that is a serious concern for this committee, then I implore us to take up H.R. 1358, which I've authored, the Scientific Integrity Act. This Congress has a duty assigned directly to this committee to ensure that public or publicly funded science is conducted, reviewed, communicated to the public, and incorporated into policymaking transparently and free from distorting political, ideological, financial, or other undue influence. Public science informs national policy on everything from pesticides to power grids. Our nation's cities and states need credible information to prepare for climate change. Our families deserve to know if unsafe chemicals are being sprayed on their food, dumped in their water, or added into the products they buy. As representatives, we need to reach conclusions on these high-stakes questions based on rigorous independent scientific facts, not predetermined opinions. We have a duty to ensure that political interference in the scientific process and attacks on the work of federal scientists do not get in the way of our responsibility to safeguard our public health and our national security. The rules and norms of our public science are standards that have made America a leading light in the global scientific community for decades. We have seen those standards being actively and deliberately eroded over the past year. Scientists should always be held to the highest ethical and professional standards. In return, it is our job to uphold standards that ensure scientists are not impugned for reporting their impartial findings. The Scientific Integrity Act restores our baseline for scientific independence by requiring every federal agency that funds or conducts scientific research to establish clear scientific integrity standards and set basic requirements for how the agency will adhere to those principles. Science is not about getting the result you want. Scientific integrity is about ensuring a process and atmosphere in which the science leads us to real, unvarnished results. The issue we should be focused on is whether glyphosate is safe, and finding the answer to this question is too important for us to let this be a partisan issue. These are chemicals that people have in their homes. This is on the food our children eat. We should be able to trust that the science we rely upon to make public health decisions is not being distorted or manipulated. While the tactics used by industry to influence science may have dramatic negative consequences on the independence and credibility of scientific review boards or advisory panels, the real victims of this kind of designed ignorance are everyday people. Without credible science to determine safe levels of exposure, millions of people around our country will be at risk. So, Dr. Sass, how do science agencies like IARC function in order to protect the public health?
Thank you. IARC and other public health institutes put out very credible information about the potential hazards of chemicals and other substances after reviewing all the data. IARC for the glyphosate assessment brought experts from all over the world, from multiple different countries. They have different areas of expertise. They all come together as a working group. All of the discussion of all of the data, publicly available data, is done in front of everybody. There's a plenary session where people get to also discuss what the different subject matter experts have come up with in their area, and the result of these very credible, transparent, publicly generated hazard assessments is to then support potentially risk assessments, but also to support non-regulatory or even non-risk related decisions that can be made, for example, not only by government regulatory agencies, but also by forward-thinking companies and businesses looking to work with safer or less toxic or less hazardous chemicals, starting to replace it in their products. There's retailers that care about this. There's a whole area of green chemistry that's very interested in this, and of course medical professionals, occupational health experts, all of these people care about understanding the hazard of materials, even if they don't, there hasn't been a full risk assessment to understand potency and dose response and the other things that come afterwards.
And why is it important that independent bodies review chemicals for potential exposure risks?
Well, all the available data should be looked at. I believe that, but that's also what the agencies believe, and it's what IARC did. Many of the studies that it relied on were supported or sponsored by the regulated industry, and that's fine, that's normal, that happens. But there are systematic review procedures for reviewing and evaluating confidence in those studies on a lot of different parameters. And if all of those different parameters aren't available to do a proper, robust review and assessment of the confidence, then it's more difficult. And so we should, instead of a priori making decisions about what data is in or out of the pot, it should all be looked at and reviewed, which is what IARC did.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I have several documents which I would like included in the record, including the Monsanto battle plan laying out their preliminary attack on IARC, the IARC preamble defining the roles of working group members and participants, a list of participants from the IARC glyphosate monograph, commentaries by several scientists on the strength of the IARC glyphosate evaluation, the FIFRA Science Advisory Panel report from December 2016 concluding that EPA did not follow its own guidelines for carcinogen risk assessment in evaluating glyphosate, and a letter from the United Nations Special Rapporteur stressing how essential the work of the National Institute of Environmental Health Science is to protecting human rights.
Without objection, and the gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
The chair now turns to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Babin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it, and thank you, witnesses, for being here. Dr. Anna Lowett, if you don't mind, the EPA's risk assessment process explicitly includes opportunities for experts who did not contribute to the assessment to review and comment on a draft of the scientific analysis. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. The EPA's risk assessments, like the one on glyphosate, developed by the Office of Pesticide Programs, are also subjected to rigorous independent peer review. Is that correct?
So EPA's cancer evaluation has been subject to the FIFRA Scientific Advisory Panel. That's true.
Okay. As I understand it, the National Academies, which is similar to IARC, develops reports by expert panels and has outside peer reviews and evaluate each and every report to ensure scientific accuracy. However, unlike EPA and NAS, IARC monographs do not employ any independent outside peer reviews. Instead, an IARC monograph working group collaborates behind closed doors to select studies, analyze data, and reach conclusions. So without any public engagement or independent scientific peer review, the working group acts hand in hand with IARC staff as judges, juries, and executioners. Clearly, these IARC procedures fall well short of meeting 21st century standards for transparency and scientific credibility, and I would like to know if you agree with that. So
what I can answer is EPA's transparent policy approach that our cancer evaluation was reviewed by the FIFRA excuse me, Scientific Advisory Panel. The transcript from that meeting is actually publicly available. Our document is now available for public, will be open for public comment. It's been released on our docket. And so our process is quite transparent.
Do any of the other witnesses agree with that statement? Now, let me repeat it. Without any public engagement or independent scientific peer review, the working group acts hand in hand with IARC staff as judge, jury, and executioner. IARC procedures fall well short of meeting 21st century standards of transparency and scientific credibility. Would you other three agree with that? Dr. Pasteur.
Yes, I would generally agree with that. I think IARC needs to be brought up to the standards of transparency that is exhibited by the United States EPA.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Sass.
I disagree because the meetings are open at IARC. Observers are invited. Monsanto was present. Other regulatory interests can also be present. So they're public in that sense that anybody who wants to be present can. Okay. And I also want to point out that EPA's Scientific Advisory Panel review of the not likely classification didn't agree with that classification.
Dr. Tyrone.
Yeah, I wouldn't agree completely with the statement, but what I believe is that right now the monograph program appears to think they're accountable to no one. So I do think that they need to be brought in, show some accountability to somebody. The fact that they did what they did with the glyphosate working group, I mean, that should not happen. The exclusion of exculpatory rodent studies many times. There's just absolutely no way that should happen. So I just would like to see more accountability.
Absolutely. Okay. Is it scientifically proper to redo a peer-reviewed study's data analysis with a different statistical analysis than was originally used for the study, and then use this reanalysis without first ensuring that it undergoes robust, independent peer review? Dr. Lloyd.
So the first half of your question is about reevaluating scientific data, and I would agree with that statement, and that is actually part of an independent evaluation of those data, is often to reevaluate the statistics. And an EPA has actually, in fact, redone some of the statistics for the glyphosate cancer evaluation.
Okay.
The second part of your question is about peer review. Peer review is important, and in the case of the cancer evaluation, we did have our statistics evaluated as part of the scientific advisory panel.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Tyrone, could I ask you that question?
I have no problem with people doing independent, different types of statistical analysis, although, you know, it does have to be peer reviewed, because sometimes you can pull tricks, you know, and get the result you want. I mean, there's a lot of data dredging, p-hacking it's sometimes called, that goes on. So peer review is essential, though, when you are evaluating multiple different types of statistical analyses.
Absolutely. And my time has expired, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has indeed expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, for 5 minutes.
Well, I thank the chairman, and I thank the witnesses. Dr. Sass, have you ever heard of the term chemical trespass?
Yes, I have. It's when you find a chemical, usually an industrial chemical, not naturally occurring in your body, that you didn't give permission for it to be there.
So do you think that a term applies to our hearing this morning?
I do, and not just to glyphosate, but certainly glyphosate. I mean, my guess is that there's not many people in the U.S. that are unexposed to glyphosate because of how widespread its use is. It's almost 300 million pounds annually, and in agriculture, and every one of those pounds are put out onto our fields, our food supplies, get into our rivers and streams and drinking water, sources of drinking water.
Well, some studies claim that human exposure to glyphosate has increased by 500% in 25 years. What kind of risks are associated with this kind of proliferation of exposure?
So we don't understand the risks, and that's one of the things that I think that EPA, should be doing, is taking on a proper risk assessment after a proper hazard assessment, where they acknowledge that there's a carcinogenic risk and then do a proper slope factor. There's proper mechanisms to do that. But the increase is being shown in people's urine, and so we know that for sure. And that's why I think that there's probably no unexposed population that we're exposed on a daily or routine basis.
Is it also present in mother's milk?
It is. It's widespread, and it's because it's water soluble. It is present in all those fluids.
So even the youngest members of our society are being highly exposed to this chemical.
It is, and that's what brings up this dose poison fallacy, this 16th century, dose poison thing, is that although it is true that, we can't be poisoned if we don't dose ourselves, that's true if we're not exposed, it's also true that there's vulnerable populations, and how each of us react to those are very different, so that a pregnant woman or a reproductive age man or woman might be much more vulnerable to certain effects, reproductive effects, for example, or if we're exposed to a carcinogen when we're young, while our tissues are developing and growing and taking in, as they take in nutrients, taking in those toxic chemicals, that could be a much more damaging time. And then the health impacts can be hardwired into the system, whereas, for example, if I'm exposed to a dose of lead, I have probably no reaction to the same dose of lead that could cause irreparable permanent harm in a developing child.
Thank you. Some folks are critical of the World Health Organization, and other folks are critical of the EPA's risk assessment. Can you explain how those assessments differ?
Sure. I mean, primarily, for some reason, a lot of the criticism, which I think isn't fair, is on whether IARC considered some studies that actually weren't available to it at the time. And my only answer is they've got to look at publicly available data. That's a rule they made in advance. Industry knows that in advance. If it wants to get those studies from advance, it could have done so. The chemicals are nominated. They have plenty of time to do that if they want to. Fundamentally, though, some of the ways that are looking at it are, for example, EPA is not looking at the high-dose tumors. The animals have tumors at high doses, but there's no other indication of toxicity to the animals at those doses. So there's no real reason not to consider those tumor effects to be real or valid. Like I say, instead of using an arbitrary number, to actually use toxicological ways of assessing whether those doses should be considered. So that's one important thing, is to consider those doses. The other thing is, when you look at it, does there have to be a clear dose response? EPA is throwing out data if there wasn't an increasing tumors with increasing doses in every study, for example, and that's not appropriate because many reasons. One is that we animals react differently, so you have to use your statistics to do that. EPA's used a certain statistical test. IARC used some different statistical tests. The EPA cancer guidelines says EPA should use whichever one provides the most health protective outcome.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I have an article published this morning by the Politico describing the European Parliament's decision to create a special committee to investigate potential failings in the EU system for reviewing pesticides such as glyphosate. The committee will look at whether the European Commission followed appropriate regulations and avoided conflict of interest when it decided to renew the license for another 5 years. I would like to introduce this story for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now turns to the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate all the witnesses being here today. And we'll start with Dr. Pastor. You touched on your testimony, but I'd like you to expand, if you would, on additional examples besides glyphosate that were perhaps classified in a misleading way by IARC.
Well, you know, what I was trying to get at in my testimony is that things like caffeic acid, arachidonic acid, these are chemicals that we find in our diet naturally. And by just simply declaring them to be carcinogenic is not helpful to the American public. They need some context with that. And my criticism of IARC is they don't provide that kind of context.
And so, still with you, Dr. Pastor, you've described that as a misleading way to classify these potential hazards, and you've advocated for a risk assessment as opposed to hazard assessment. And I thought, and I don't want to misinterpret, but I thought I heard Dr. Sass refer to this kind of dose level type thing as being 16th century, a 16th century approach. Do you want to rebut that?
I definitely do. I think it's absolutely as true as it was in the 16th century. And the best example I can give is the one I gave earlier on aspirin, is that the dose makes the poison. It's just as good at a low dose. In fact, the actual statement by Paracelsus in the 16th century was that the difference between a medicine and a poison is the dose. Aspirin is a good example of that. 2 tablets will relieve your headache. A bottle full of it will kill you. That's the dose makes the poison. It's as true today as it was back in the 16th century and long before that. It's important to realize that because in some of these studies that are being cited here, whether it's glyphosate or otherwise, these are animals that have been packed full of some of these chemicals for a lifetime. And I'm probably one of the few people in this room that's actually conducted those very studies. And they go on for 2 years. They're given to animals at the maximum dose that they can get. And even though Dr. Sass refers to the animals not having any adverse effects, they're getting as much as 3% of their diet of that particular chemical. That's outrageous. It's something that no human would ever see, and the results are meaningless and not useful in the context of risk assessment and communication of that information to the American public.
And Dr. Lawat, I want to just ask you quickly, I don't want my time to totally expire here, but the EPA sets tolerance levels for residue of glyphosate, and you've talked about the actual exposure to chemicals, not simply ask if a chemical could ever be a carcinogen. And EPA takes a different approach than IARC. Why does the EPA take the approach it takes?
So EPA is a risk-based organization which is consistent with federal statute, and largely for the reasons that Dr. Pastor just explained, that it is important to assess not only the hazard but with the exposure of a particular chemical. And it is at that intersection of hazard and exposure where we understand risk. And our job is to understand risk to the American people.
And I'm going to close out here by just covering a couple of statements. We've heard one of our previous questioners, when he was giving his statement prior to asking questions, says, we don't want the, quote, science we rely on is not distorted or manipulated, close quote. He didn't want that our science to be distorted or manipulated. And additionally, the idea of independent bodies look at at this. We want independent bodies to be looking at these types of chemicals and potential hazards to us. But what if there is a conflict of interest? And I'm going to introduce, Mr. Chairman, without objection, I'd like to introduce a letter written in 2002, 15 years ago or so, by one of our panelists, Dr. Sass, where she noted that IARC's working groups are made behind closed doors. No transcripts of the deliberations are publicly available. Most significant, the voting of the working group members is never made public. This lack of transparency and lack of public oversight makes peer review impossible. In the letter that we received back from Dr. Wild, at this point, there's no indication that any of the processes have changed in the last 16 years. And thus, I'm very concerned about IARC and their processes in this issuing these monologues monographs. And so, with that, Mr. Chairman, I introduce that letter.
Without objection. The gentleman yields back the balance of his time.
I do, thank you.
And the gentleman, or the chair now turns to the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter, for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And Dr. Sass, I just going to ask you a pretty open-ended question. I've been able to sit through some of this testimony. Obviously, there's some very different approaches and opinions just listening to the last 15 minutes. So are there some issues that you think really need to be brought out in more detail? And if so, what are they?
Thank you. With regards to the IARC 2002 letter, which I point out is quite a long time ago, at that time that was 3 chiefs of the monograph program ago, and at that point we were concerned that they were allowing people with financial conflicts of interest to be part of the voting working group. And since then they have established conflict guidelines that are world-renowned. They're very well respected, they're very well implemented, and those kinds of things are well tracked and well reported, and so there's a comfort level, and so those issues are not, have not been relevant for a long time. As far as the differences between the 2 assessments, it really is a difference between whether you're doing the hazard only and then going to a risk assessment, or whether you're conflating them together. And IARC does a hazard only. They just say whether there's an association with cancer or not, and then if you want to do a risk assessment or do regulatory actions, those things will come differently. I do not understand why EPA is not going through its process to develop a slope factor and a dose response and a potency estimate, and instead just calling it not likely, dismissing quite a lot of evidence of tumors. And you're wrong about Dr. Portier. He's actually updated his tables, and there's quite a few tumors there, which I would be happy to submit or have someone else have him submit to the record, that have been disregarded. What I don't understand is why the Pesticide Office is working with the EPA's Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention, which is the Science Policy Office, which is headed by Dr. Nancy Beck, a former chemical industry lobbyist, to implement a systematic review procedure for its data that was reviewed by the National Academies in 2007 and was called fundamentally flawed. Something that National Academies have never called anything before. And instead of, for example, working with the EPA IRIS program, the Integrated Risk Information System program, which is in the Office of Research and Development, the science office of EPA, and which could work with them to develop potency estimates and slope factors, and then a risk assessment at that point.
So, let me see. So the real difference here is, one is just sort of purely data-driven in determining, whether or not there's potential carcinogens, and then there's kind of a political and, policy decision being made as to, okay, it's risky, it's not, the dose is okay, the dose is not okay, but it's problematic to begin with, but we've looked at it on behalf of the EPA and the country and say, this is okay, but there's a problem. Am I off?
No, you are spot on.
Okay, well then, with that, I'm going to yield back.
Before the gentleman yields back, would he yield to the doctor from the EPA for a comment?
Sure.
Thank you for that. So I think it's important that we make sure the record is accurate. The Office of Pesticide Program is actually part of the Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention. And in fact, Dr. Sass's comments about systematic review and the IRIS program are inaccurate. The IRIS program, as publicly discussed in many venues in the last year, is actually moving towards systematic review, which is the recommendations of the National Academies of Sciences. So EPA's evaluation is consistent with the National Academies.
Dr. Sass, do you have a comment?
Yeah, there's two different systematic reviews happening within EPA in parallel. One is being developed by Dr. Nancy Beck, a former ACC, American Chemistry Council, lobbyist until very recently, and one is being developed by the scientists within the IRIS program. The IRIS program, it doesn't prioritize or preferentially treat industry-supplied data, whereas the other systematic review does. For example, guideline studies, GLP, it's called Good Laboratory Practices, which were developed for industry studies specifically to stop them from lying and cheating about their data. If you apply systematic review properly, you would look at all the data with the same rules.
All right, my time has expired. I yield back to the chair.
And on that note, the chair is going to turn to the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the panelists for appearing before us today. We have certainly challenging issues in front of us regarding what's real and what's not. We all want to protect the American people from unnecessary harm, but we also want to move forward with sound science as we do so. So this is a bipartisan effort, and I'm quite sure that the scientists before us and the experts that have testified before us and met with us in our offices agree that we have a common goal here. That the American farmer feeds the world. And the studies that I've read, including EPA reports and various other research documents, use verbiage like most likely and probable and potentially increased risk regarding the primary chemical within Roundup. It's a herbicide used to increase crop yield. So now I clearly recall a few years ago the rumor that plastic bottles cause cancer was widespread. Now, we all drink from plastic bottles. I've never seen a colleague eat the bottle. So the usage of Roundup in reality on farms across America and in households is used very carefully because it's very expensive. They use computerized disbursement on large farm machinery to carefully disperse this stuff. The protective clothing is worn. So I would say that a hungry child that the American farmer feeds across the world by the compassion and generosity of our nation, Mr. Chairman, a hungry child is concerned about overcoming that hunger at that moment with food provided by the American farmer, as opposed to most likely, probable, or potentially increased risk of cancer sometime down the line. So I have a question. You said something, Dr. Lowett, very interesting earlier. You stated that EPA conducted its assessment of glyphosate with conservative risk assumption. Can you please clarify for us what that means? What is a conservative risk assumption?
So as a measure to be resource efficient in our risk assessment process, we use a tiering process when we evaluate exposure. Our Tier 1 assessments use high-end estimates that are health protective and often even compound those assumptions together. And in the case of glyphosate, we've done a health protective Tier 1 level, in most cases, assessment that uses health protective conservative assumptions and came to the conclusion, despite those conservative assumptions, that there's no risk to humans, including infants and children.
Would you recommend changes to the IARC to make this program, to ensure transparency and reliable reporting to the public that you're attempting to inform? Is there some improvement or streamlining of the scientific process where data can be shared amongst perhaps conflicting conclusions by various scientists, including scientists from organizations from other nations. Can there be more transparency and inclusion of scientific data so that we can come to a conclusion? Because, you know, the loss of Roundup would definitely hurt the production of crop yield across the world, and there'd be an immediate impact felt worldwide. So do you have suggestions on how to improve the process so we can arrive at the truth ultimately?
So EPA is not bound by our IARC conclusions. As noted in my testimony, we've come to the conclusion that glyphosate's not likely a carcinogenic to humans, and that's similar to many other nations in the world, including our Canadian colleagues and the European Food Safety Bureau.
European colleagues. I concur. Dr. Sass, could you add to that?
Well, the European assessment is being investigated because it's been shown that they took the first draft from Monsanto and they barely redlined it. So I don't think that should be held up as the high bar. And as far as transparency and the use of glyphosate, I just think a proper risk assessment should be done. And what's happening here is that the EPA is doing the hazard assessment and calling it not likely without doing the slope factor and the risk assessment. I'm guessing because it favors Monsanto's interest for selling it abroad.
Do you recommend that that Roundup be pulled from the market?
No, that has not been our recommendation.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes my neighbor from the great state of Kansas, Dr. Marshall, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chairman. And I guess I would start by, you had a standing joke with my pastor, and every week you would ask me, does coffee cause cancer this week, Doc? And I would say, well, I hope not, because I usually had a cup of coffee in my hands. So I just continue to be amazed. Now I'm reading this, and I see that IARC once upon a time actually said it was a carcinogen, so that shocks me. I'm also a little bit surprised to see that the United States has given $48 million to IARC, which is located in Lyon, France. A beautiful place by accounts of all the paintings I've seen of that area, but I'm not sure why we're spending American dollars over there. You know, to go to my question, I'll start with Dr. Pasteur, the first one. Obviously, there's a big difference between hazard and risk, and on its webpage, IARC contends that it does not make a judgment about risk. So IARC says it does not make a judgment about risk. However, on the front page of its monograph, it states that it evaluates carcinogenic risk to humans. This seems really misleading. I'm a biochemist, I'm a physician. You can go down the dirt here a little bit if you want to, but if it's not talking about making judgment regarding to risk, saying something carcinogenic is exactly declaring it's a risk. Can you help me understand this better?
Representative Marshall, thank you for that question, because that's core to the testimony that I'm giving today. And that's that the difference between the word hazard and risk is absolutely crucially important. Because if a patient comes to you and says, well, what should I do about caffeic acid or caffeine or whatever they're asking you about, you have to put that in context. Minimize your exposure or avoid it altogether, whatever it is. What IARC does is stops with half a loaf, half of the description. They're just saying it's carcinogenic and leaves it at that point. It is not a risk assessment. It's simply a hazard assessment. That's not useful. It's actually injurious. It's also, I think, irresponsible, and I think it's harmful to the American public.
You know, one of our jobs here in Congress is to prioritize the dollars we do have on research. And in Kansas, we have big issues with the sugarcane aphid, with the wheat mosaic virus. I mean, to me, prioritizing monies for those would seem to take precedent over this. I'll go to Dr. Lowett with my next question. I think just to hammer this point home, explain to me the EPA. So I'm new to Congress. How does the EPA make its assessment? Is it hazards only? When you just determine what chemicals are safe or not, do you use just the hazard assessment, or how do you do it?
So consistent with federal statute, EPA does risk assessment. So we evaluate both the hazard and the exposure and then evaluate them together.
Does that often lead to, are there examples of some chemicals that are a hazard only and as opposed to a risk as well? As
a general rule, no, EPA does risk assessment, not hazard assessment.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I believe everyone's had an opportunity for questions. Does the ranking member have any concluding comments?
I don't. Thank you.
Ranking member does not. Chair simply wishes to thank our panel for being here and to express our appreciation for the insights gained today. Obviously, this is a subject matter that we will continue to delve into with great depth, and in particular to our fellow public official from the EPA, I appreciate the challenges you're caught between. With that, the record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional written comments and written questions from the members. This hearing is adjourned.